Hello, my name is Hakon and welcome back to my channel and the second set of videos in my new series where I talk about my own poetry. And as I said, it's a set of videos, so there'll be one just before this, which is the actual poem I'm talking about. And then there's this video, which is where I talk about a particular poem, and there'll be a third video in this case, not always, where I will have a piece of music that uses the poem as lyrics to a song, in this case created with the AI music generator UDO. So of course the lyrics are mine, I put in the lyrics manually using the poem, and the music and singing is generated with artificial intelligence. So the poem I've chosen for this second part of my series is one that I feel is not my most typical style of poem. Normally, that is to say, most of my poetry, at least it feels like it, are lyrical poems where the rhythm and rhyme is quite regular. As two major poetic devices that I use to show the poeticness of the writing. Of course, not something that is strictly speaking necessary for a poem to be a poem. There are completely different criteria for what makes a poem. That has nothing to do with poetic devices at all, actually. But I'm not going to go too much into that now because that's a completely separate subject and that's a completely separate video that I will make one day where I talk about why, what makes a poem, and of course the quite closely related what makes art, art. Subject for another day. So this is not a poem that adheres to my normal style of lyrical poetry writing. It's certainly not the way I did it most of the time when I started out writing poetry in the mid-90s. But I thought that it was a good follow-up to my previous one, which was about a poem called Timeless Birds, and that is because I feel these are thematically very closely linked. In that, in my deliberation and my discussion on Timeless Birds, I specifically talked about how it describes something that I call the sublime moment, or usually in my poetry I speak of eternal moments, everlasting moments, that kind of figurative way of expressing it, because sometimes you have moments where you feel the moment so entirely, and this is often when you connect with someone else, or with a sensation. It could also be with nature, for instance, and of course for people who are religious it could be when you connect with whatever your concept of God is as well, which I think is quite a similar kind of experience in the way it's often described. And it doesn't have to be a romantic connection to someone else. It could just be a connection where you feel like you're entirely on the same wavelength as another person, and you share a connection that goes beyond the normal way that you talk to people or interact with people. It's kind of hard to put into words in normal language, I feel, and that is because that's one of the reasons why it makes sense to write poetry about it, because that's another thing I probably will say something about when I talk about what makes poetry poetry, because I'll just mention it now, because one of the things about poetry is that it breaks the rules of normal language use in order to express something beyond what normal language can express. At least it uses language in a way that makes you see the language itself and reinterpret it when you read it. And therefore it makes it possible for the poem to express, or at least for the reader to understand, something that is more than just what it says on the page. So any kind of transcendental experience, like these sublime moments that where the past and the future pretty much cease to exist for you, even if it's just for a really short time, you get this sense of endlessness, and that's a kind of experience that is very hard to express, I think. But if you do it in a poem, it makes more sense. So again, this is a poem that talks about, perhaps even more so, I think, than the previous one, an eternal moment, a sublime moment where there is a special connection with someone that is hard to express, and something that I wanted to put down on paper at some point. It is quite possible, although I can't remember for sure whether this poem was actually written about the same experience that it was written in the summer of 1994. It is possible it was written in 1994, but it was definitely not written until I came back home from my study trip in York, England, May 1994. I know that for sure. I didn't write so much when I was in York, but I did spend a lot of time the rest of the summer writing. So it is quite possible it was written specifically, for me anyway, with the same experience in mind, with a special connection I had with someone, and of course the experience of falling in love, perhaps the first time I properly fell in love. Of course, it is part of the story that didn't work out as a relationship. I mean, it never turned into a relationship in the first place, in the romantic sense. But at the same time, of course, I feel that I needed that experience as a catalyst to understanding my own emotions. That's one thing, and also it's one of those things that became a formative experience, something that shaped me as a person for later. And yeah, and of course in hindsight I sort of realized it would have never worked out anyway, because the person in question, she is a cat person and I'm a dog person, so well, there you go. That's yeah, that's just by the by. Anyway, so as I mentioned earlier, this particular poem doesn't have the same kind of rhythm and rhyme lyrical look to it that most of my poetry has. But if you look at it, if you look at every second line, it has quite a regular rhythm to it. So if you disregard the first line and you go on the second one, it's eternal summer's day, the sun's reflection in a brook, the early morning song of birds, the breeze against my face. So those are actually quite regular, and it's the shorter lines that alternate with these that have a little bit more freedom to them in terms of rhythm. And this is something that I feel works quite well. It's almost like a call and response kind of thing. There's one expression and then of course a description of it, and or an impression of what it feels like. Because if you look at the poem, it describes the actual experience. So a smile of beauty, so that's something that's your sensory, what you feel with your senses to see somebody smiling. And then it says eternal summer's day. Two shining eyes, again, it's what you see. The sun's reflection in a brook, not literally, but metaphorically, and that's how you feel. So again, it's a very specific kind of structure to it, even though it's not obviously lyrical. And that is something that I can't remember if that was deliberate when I wrote it, but certainly it felt right. And it still feels right to me, this particular poem. It feels very poetic to me. And that structure is part of it. Now, one thing that I'm probably going to mention quite often in these videos is metaphor, of course. And a lot of poetry does. One of the major things that is done in poetry is to compare things to other things. and usually you sort of class these as similes or metaphors most of the time. And they come in a few different flavors. So if you say that um, a smile of beauty is like an eternal summer's day, that is a simile. You're comparing two things. If you say a smile of beauty is an eternal summer's day, then it's a metaphor. And of course, you don't have to include the verb there. In this case, it just says a smile of beauty, eternal summer's day. So that's your also a kind of metaphor, but without the verb included, which is something I like doing sometimes. I feel it sort of it almost removes the sign, the linguistic sign of displaying that it's a metaphor while being a metaphor. Um, and as a reader, you just sort of pick up on the fact that these two things are, in a way, the same thing. So a smile of beauty is an eternal summer's day. Two shining eyes are the sun's reflection in the brook, etc. So, yeah. So that's a way of using metaphor that I quite like. And this one does not really use, it doesn't use rhyme. It doesn't really use any major alliteration, although there is some alliteration going on with beauty, brook, birds, and breeze, which of course ties many of these sort of keywords start with B, which ties the whole poem together. But in this one, the main thing I feel about this poem is that, more so, I think, than many of my other poems, it manages to just very simply express just a moment without talking too much about what happens before or what happens after, or trying to establish an overarching metaphor first and then trying to relate that to something. So it feels more in the moment than, I would say, most of my poetry that has to do with moments. And that's one of the reasons I like it so much, I think. One of my favorites, I would say, which I will say of several other poems of mine, by the way. But this is one of the ones that might fly a little bit under the radar because it stylistically is a little bit anonymous, perhaps. But if you read it slowly and and just try to relate to it, I think it's one of those that certainly for me is going to be one of the ones that I will perhaps look at the most and say that, yeah, that's, I quite like that. So I'm not sure how much more there is to say about it, because I feel this poem perhaps speaks for itself quite a lot. You will notice, of course, we were on Timeless Birds last time, and the sort of the references to the birds again here. The singing of birds is something that I will sort of reuse a little bit as a reference, I think, in several of my poems, especially the ones that I wrote that same summer. And one of the reasons I use these as reference as well is that the girl that I was falling in love with, even though that never came to anything, of course, she actually, I did actually show her the poem that I talked about last time, Timeless Birds. She did actually get to read that during those those weeks in New York. And so when I was writing poetry afterwards, I was sometimes making references back to that, almost as if I had in mind to show her that poem as well, and of course allowing that reference to be there specifically for her. and of course, the kind of moment that this poem describes is also a reference to the time that she and I spent together, because she did. I had a beard at the time, so at the time, if you can imagine, I had a bit of a longer beard than this. Not super long, but just enough that it's, yeah. And she did touch my face. She did touch my cheek, and which was very, very nice. And it did feel, because I had a beard, perhaps especially, it did feel like the breeze against my face. So there is actually a very specific reference to that in this poem. A gentle touch, the breeze against my face. And she would have known that if she had read this poem, which she didn't read. I never showed this to her, I'm quite sure. Um, and so it's not just an abstract thing. It's not just a generic thing. For me, it was a very specific moment I was actually referring to in this poem. When I was writing it, it was a very specific experience. Um, and is that all I can say about it? Yes, perhaps it is. Another thing, perhaps, that is worthy of note in this context, and that is that poems don't need to be very complex. This is a very simple poem, but at the same time, being simple doesn't mean that it doesn't potentially have not have a lot to say. Even simple poems can say a lot and can be interesting and can express something profound. And often they do it better than the longer ones, the wordy ones as well, because if you are trying to express something that goes beyond words, the more words you add, the more you root that expression in the limitations of normal language. So when you use few words, it's easier for the words, or the meaning of those words, or the potential meaning of those words, to transcend the words that are used. I'm not sure if that's clear to everyone, but perhaps you understand what I'm saying, and maybe I shouldn't use too many words trying to explain it further because of the same principle. If I try to explain it too much, then maybe it becomes less clear. It's possible. So, and that's why short poems, especially the ones that are trying to describe just an atmosphere or a feeling or a moment, perhaps are better off using as few words as possible. And as a reader of poetry, you just start filling in the blanks, as it were. The fewer words you say, the more words you don't say. And as a reader, you're trying to find some of those other words that are not said. The space between the notes, as some people might express it when you are talking about music. You try to find out what is not there as well as what is there. And in that difference between what is and what isn't is where the art often is, and where you find things that can mean something to you, and that has a meaning that you as a reader, or as somebody who experiences art, is the one assigning that particular meaning, as opposed to the one who made the expression itself, whether it's the music or the poem or the dance or whatever kind of expression it is. So I'll leave you with that, and I'll follow up this video with a song with this as lyrics, which I thought came out rather well as well, if I must say so myself. And I'll see you in the next one. So thank you for watching, and goodbye for now. Bye bye.